Big Shaq's wife walked into a luxury jewelry store, elegant, composed, and unseen. Seconds later, she was asked to open her purse. What they didn't know. Her husband was Big Shaq. No shouting, no threat, just a phone call, and a $12 million transaction that turned quiet racism into a global reckoning. They tried to humiliate his wife. Instead, they lit the match that set a system on fire. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. They didn't walk in like royalty. That's the first thing people never understand about Shaquille O'Neal. With all his size, fame, and money, he carries himself like a man raised on soft-spoken lessons and hard-won wisdom. When Big Shaq walks into a place, he fills it, but never demands it. That morning in Beverly Hills, the sun rested gently on the sidewalk outside Cavitt & Reed's, a luxury jewelry store that boasted centuries of craftsmanship, velvet-lined cases, and security cameras that blinked more than they saw. Shaq wore a simple slate gray hoodie, no logos, no branding, just comfort. Celeste, his wife of 12 years, moved beside him, with a grace that didn't beg for attention. Her long coat was beige, crisp, unwrinkled. Her purse small, elegant. Not flashy, not loud. But still, when she stepped inside the boutique, every pair of eyes clicked toward her like motion sensors awakening. A bell above the door chimed. Shaq nodded politely to the greeter. An older man with a trim beard, and the unsure smile of someone who thinks they might be dreaming. "Good morning," Shaq offered, his voice deeper than the room, yet warm. The man murmured something back, uncertain whether to treat him like a client or a celebrity. Shaq made it easy. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a $20 bill. Outside the store, a homeless man had been curled near the curb, his cardboard sign tipped with rainwater. Shaq handed the 20 to the greeter, and said softly, "Could you pass this to the guy out front? Make sure he eats today." The greeter blinked. "Of course, sir." Shaq smiled, then turned to Celeste. "Take your time," he said. "No rush. We're just looking." And they were at first. Celeste loved artisan work. She saw more in jewelry than stones, and shine. She saw stories. That was something she'd always said. Jewelry tells you who made it, and who wore it. She floated quietly past the rows of watches, bracelets, and earrings, while Shaq stood back, content to observe. But the air in the room had changed. Maybe it started with the woman in the navy blue blazer. Short hair, stiff posture, expensive perfume. She stood behind the central counter, tapping her nails on the glass. Riley, her name tag read. She watched Celeste not as a client, but as a question, like something out of place. It wasn't loud. It wasn't rude. But it was there. The way Riley offered a slight nod instead of a greeting. The way her hand hovered near the case's lock when Celeste leaned a bit closer. How her smile was tighter when she addressed Shaq, but never Celeste. Little things. Microscopic tells in a world of practiced civility. Shaq noticed. He'd seen it before. Too many times. He didn't react. Not yet. He just shifted slightly, as if positioning himself between the judgment and the woman he loved. But Celeste noticed too. She always did. Her eyes flicked toward him, not fearful but aware. It wasn't the first time she'd been looked through. Instead of that, it likely wouldn't be the last. They moved to a different counter, slower this time. Shaq saw the cameras turning, not to him, not anymore, to Celeste's hands, to the coat she wore, to the purse on her shoulder. Security wore suits here, nothing bulky, nothing aggressive, but their steps across the showroom floor still echoed. Soft soles, sharp eyes. Still, Celeste pressed forward with quiet dignity, pausing at a display that shimmered with sapphire fire. A single necklace lay at the center, so vivid it looked like the sea had been carved into stone. White diamonds surrounded the blue, hugging it like lightning frozen in time. It wasn't just expensive. It was rare. It whispered legacy. Shaq walked over beside her, curious. "That the one?" he asked, his tone light. Celeste didn't answer immediately. Her hand hadn't touched the case. She knew better than to tempt that. Yet somehow Riley was already drifting over, uninvited. "Those are for private showing," she said, a little too quick, a little too crisp. "By appointment only." Celeste stepped back instinctively. Her expression neutral, not angry, just tired. The way people get when they've walked this road before. Shaq looked at Riley, calmly. Not hostile, not confrontational. But there was something in his eyes, something that said, "You think you're subtle? You're not." I didn't say we wanted to buy it, he said evenly. We're just looking. Riley's response was a smile that didn't bend her eyes. Of course, just informing you of our policy. It was always the policy. Policy was the polite face of bias. It was the script used to justify suspicion, to reinforce doubt. Shaq had heard it all his life. From banks, from hotels, from stores where his card was flagged even after the signature cleared. The famous face, the massive body, the millions in his accounts. None of it was armor against the stare of those who didn't expect worth from the people who looked like him. Celeste nodded once. No words. But her hand moved quietly back to her coat pocket, tucking her fingers inside. It was a signal, a habit. Make yourself smaller, safer, palatable. Shaq hated it. He didn't show it. He never did, not in public. That was something his mother, Lucille, taught him young. I want to see you rage, she'd said. But if you stay still, they don't know what to do. So he stayed still. But inside the weight grew. It wasn't just about Celeste. It was about the man outside, still waiting for food. About the teachers he'd seen fired for doing the right thing. About the store manager who once asked him to use the back entrance when he showed up without a suit. About every moment that made you second-guess your place, even when you had every right to be there. A woman entered the store behind them, blonde, glossy, wrapped in white designer silk. Her shoes clicked louder than the bell. The energy shifted immediately. Riley smiled for real this time. A full display of teeth. Welcome back, Miss Klein, she said with bright enthusiasm. Miss Klein didn't see Celeste, didn't see Shaq, walked straight to the watch section, and was offered champagne within 30 seconds. Shaq let out a slow breath. He stepped away from the sapphire case, looked around the room. 5 clerks, 2 security guards, 3 customers, all watching in some way, too directly, or too carefully. And Celeste? Still standing tall. Her face unreadable, but he could feel it in the way her fingers flexed in her pocket, like she was counting breaths. 12 years they'd been together. He'd seen her at her strongest, negotiating contracts, running community centers, counseling young women. But this silent indignity, this gaze that questioned her character without ever using her name, that was the fight she hated most. Because you can't argue with suspicion. It doesn't announce itself. It just settles, like dust. Shaq looked down at the necklace one more time, not because of its beauty, but because of what it now symbolized. The day hadn't turned loud. Not yet. But storms don't always start with thunder. Sometimes, it's the silence that shakes the ground. It didn't take long. Less than 5 minutes inside Caviton Reed's, and already something began to change in the air, not in volume, but in texture. There's a kind of silence that buzzes, that says more than words ever could. That's the kind of silence Celeste walked through, like wading into a sea of eyes trying not to stare, and yet they stared anyway, not directly, but enough for her to feel it. Celeste moved slowly, deliberately, pausing at each glass display, as though she were taking in not just the jewelry, but the history, the craftsmanship, the soul behind the metal. She had always been someone who felt things more deeply than she let on. She didn't perform her presence. She inhabited it. That made people uneasy, especially here, especially now, especially when her skin didn't match the wallpaper of wealth this store was used to serving. Behind the glass, golden chains shimmered under halogen lights. Emerald cuffs blinked under the weight of price tags. Most people never asked to see. But it wasn't the jewelry that glistened most in the room. It was scrutiny, soft and sharp, from the clerks, from the guards, from the woman in pearls adjusting her grip on her handbag as Celeste passed by. Riley was the kind of employee who memorized protocol to the syllable. She'd worked her way up, from cleaner to clerk, to assistant floor manager. Her precision wasn't just in how she walked or talked, it was in how she judged. And she judged often, subtly, quietly, always with a smile, never with a slur. That's what made it harder to name, harder to fight, harder to prove. She watched Celeste like a librarian. Watches a toddler near a bookshelf, not with hate, but with doubt. Doubt in whether she belonged. Doubt in whether she understood the rules of a room like this. Doubt in whether anything about her was real. The purse, the coat, the posture, the ring on her finger. And yet Riley said nothing. She simply trailed. Too close to be casual, too far to be called out. A few feet behind Celeste, she hovered, like smoke near fire. Shaq saw it. Of course he saw it. He had been watching the whole room since the moment they stepped in. Not just with his eyes, but with instinct. Instinct formed from decades of being sized up by people who thought size alone told them everything. His calm demeanor wasn't ignorance. It was strategy. Because sometimes the only way to disarm a loaded gaze is to pretend it doesn't shake you. He stayed a few paces back, arms crossed loosely, pretending to check his phone, but his focus never left Celeste, and never left Riley. She wasn't alone. Another associate, thinner, younger, nervous, appeared behind the register and whispered something into Riley's ear. Riley didn't respond with words, just a look. And then a nod, almost imperceptible, but enough to send the other woman walking toward the back. That was the moment Shaq's internal alarms moved from yellow to orange. He'd seen this playbook. Step 1, observe. Step 2, whisper. Step 3, check credentials. Step 4, call security. Not loudly, not rudely, just enough to say, we're being cautious. Celeste, meanwhile, approached the centerpiece of the store, a circular display lit like a crown jewel chamber. At its heart, resting on dark velvet, lay the $12 million necklace. The kind of piece that doesn't just sparkle but commands. It was more than luxury, it was legacy, crafted for monarchs, kept behind reinforced glass, and probably insured for more than most homes. Her eyes didn't light up. She wasn't a person drawn to price. She was drawn to artistry. And this necklace? It told a story. Layers of deep blue sapphire interrupted by bursts of diamond, like calm oceans interrupted by lightning storms. There was something about the asymmetry, the tension in the design, that held her. Shaq saw it too, but his attention was split. Behind them, Riley circled again, slower this time, with the slight lean of someone trying to overhear. Her eyes flicked to the necklace, then to Celeste's hands, still at her sides, never once touching the glass. She said nothing, but the tension in her jaw said everything. Shaq stepped closer to his wife, not out of protection, but partnership. It was a subtle message. She's not alone here. His voice stayed low. That the one? He asked. Celeste nodded slowly. It's breathtaking. Before another word could pass between them, Riley cleared her throat. It was the kind of throat clearing used to summon attention without apology. I'm afraid that piece is not available for walk-ins, she said. Still smiling, always smiling. Viewings by appointment only. We do have a catalog if you'd like to browse. Celeste blinked, not surprised, but wounded all the same. Not because she'd been denied, but because she hadn't even asked. Riley's refusal came preemptively, like a verdict passed before the trial. Shaq tilted his head slightly. We were just admiring, he said. Riley's smile remained, but her tone chilled. Of course. Just protocol. Protocol. That word again. The invisible guardrail for discrimination in places that sell politeness like perfume. Shaq wanted to speak. He really did. But something held him. Maybe it was Celeste's posture. Tall, unbent. Maybe it was the memory of Lucille's voice again. Let your silence shame them. Or maybe it was strategy, because reacting now would give them what they wanted. A reason to escalate. He exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled. Celeste turned away from the necklace, giving it one last glance that seemed to weigh more than admiration. It carried history, disappointment, and the crushing realization that sometimes beauty comes wrapped in poison. Behind them, the younger clerk returned. She looked pale, uncertain. Riley met her eyes. A flicker of confusion passed between them. Something unsaid. Something unplanned. Then, from the back room, a man emerged. Not a guard, not a sales rep. The manager. Sharp suit, shiny shoes, expression unreadable. He walked directly toward Shaq and Celeste, brushing past a customer without a word. Good morning, he said, extending a hand. I'm Caleb Stone. I run this location. Is everything all right today? Polite. Disarming. But calculated. Shaq shook his hand. Firm but not forceful. Wasn't aware there was a problem, he replied. Caleb's smile didn't budge. We just like to ensure all of our guests are well taken care of. And there it was. The softest, most corporate way to say, we're watching you. Celeste didn't flinch. We're fine. Just browsing. Of course, Caleb said. Feel free to let us know if you'd like anything brought out. We do require card verification before handling certain items, as I'm sure you understand. The words fell like raindrops, calm, cold, and designed to seep through layers. Shaq looked him in the eye. Is that standard for everyone? A pause. Barely a breath, but the hesitation was louder than any answer. Yes, Caleb said eventually. For items of that tier, yes. It wasn't the truth. And they all knew it. But the truth in rooms like these rarely wears a name tag. Celeste turned to leave the center display. Riley stepped aside just enough to avoid physical proximity, as if worried the act of brushing shoulders might burn. She said nothing this time. No smile. No farewell. Just that look. That look that spoke louder than words. It said, "You don't belong here." It said, "You're being watched." It said, "Whatever you're worth, it isn't this." Shaq followed Celeste as she walked back toward the front of the store, passing the same rows they'd entered through. But now everything felt colder. The bracelet sparkled less. The air felt thicker. And somewhere in the background, soft piano music continued to play. Ironically, something smooth and jazzy, like Miles Davis trying to drown out the tension. At the door, the greeter stood awkwardly, eyes darting, unsure whether to say goodbye. Shaq nodded once. Celeste didn't break stride. Outside, the sun hadn't moved much, but inside, something had shifted forever. Shaq paused at the window, staring back at the necklace from the street. That centerpiece. That symbol. That provocation. It hadn't been touched, but somehow, it had touched everything. It started with a question. Soft, clipped, and coated in false courtesy. Riley's voice slipped in like a splinter under the skin. "Could you not touch the case, ma'am?" Her tone was low but carried just loud enough to ensure the nearest customers, the security team, and the manager could hear. Celeste hadn't touched the glass. Not really. Her palm hovered maybe half an inch above the surface. Steady, measured, graceful. A gesture of admiration, not intent. But that didn't matter. Riley didn't correct what happened. She corrected what she assumed could. Celeste's eyes flicked toward her. Calm but firm. No apology. No flinch. Just the cool restraint of someone who had spent a lifetime managing the discomfort of others. Riley smiled, all politeness and posture, but behind it was the smirk of someone who thought she had caught something. A slight out of place, a detail deserving of redirection. Shaq had been standing a few steps behind, pretending to browse the cufflinks' expensive, gaudy pieces he'd never wear. But his ears caught the shift in pitch, the change in air. His head turned slowly toward the sound, just in time to catch the last half-second of the moment. The edge of Riley's smirk, Celeste stepping back, the tension ballooning without ever bursting. And then came the whisper. It wasn't a loud conversation. Riley didn't raise her voice, but her posture changed, angled toward the younger clerk, the same one who'd earlier looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. Riley's lips moved quickly, eyes darting between Celeste and the necklace. Her fingers gestured subtly toward the case. The clerk hesitated, glancing around the store, then gave a nervous nod before disappearing again through the double doors leading to the office in back. Celeste turned toward Shaq, eyes meeting his. Nothing was said, but everything was understood. The store was crowded enough to create cover, but quiet enough for the tension to thread through the room. The kind of tension that pulls you taut without breaking. Shaq didn't move, his arms folded, his jaw tight, not clenched in anger, but in restraint, in the practiced performance of stillness. They waited. Not long. It was no more than a minute, but in spaces like these, time doesn't tick, it scrapes. Every second became heavier, saturated with anticipation and invisible alarms. Then the manager returned. Not Caleb this time, but a new figure. Mid-40s, thick neck, earpiece curled around one ear, like a question mark waiting for permission. He wasn't in uniform. That was the point. Private security. The kind hired for discretion, trained to look like staff but act like law. He approached with a smile that didn't belong. It was the kind of smile that's been rehearsed, edited, designed in boardrooms. Friendly, firm, undeniable. "Ma'am," he began, nodding toward Celeste. "Would you mind stepping aside for just a moment?" Her brows rose, slow and cautious. "Excuse me?" The man didn't flinch. "Just a quick check. If you could open your bag, please." The words dropped like ice in the room. Cold, loud, even though he'd said them quietly. Celeste didn't move. For a moment, the only thing that shifted was her breathing. Measured, shallow. Her hand, still resting gently on the strap of her purse, didn't twitch. Her face, poised and polished, betrayed only the faintest tremble near the corner of her mouth. Shaq stepped forward, Just one step.
No sound from his mouth, no gesture, but it was a step that altered the room. The security man's back straightened, his smile thinned, and Riley, who had returned to the shadows of the center counter, now watched with the kind of anticipation usually reserved for fireworks and implosions. Celeste's voice came softly, like a question wrapped in iron. "Are you accusing me of stealing something?" The man offered a hand, open-palmed, rehearsed in its innocence. "Of course not, ma'am. It's just store protocol. Random checks. For high-value items." Shaq's eyes locked onto him, unwavering. "Protocol," he repeated, like the word left a bad taste. "Yes, sir. Just routine." Celeste turned her gaze slowly across the room. No one said anything. But they all watched. Even the other customers. Some pretending to browse, others just frozen mid-motion. Eyes darting between the necklace and the woman, now being treated like a risk. "I haven't left the store," she said, her voice quiet but sharpened. "I haven't touched a thing. What exactly are you checking for?" Riley's voice cut in from a few feet back, casual, distant. "It's a standard precaution. We've had incidents." There it was again. That implication without declaration. Shaq's hands were still by his side, but every nerve in his body pulled taut. He could feel his mother's teachings crawling up his spine. "You don't need to shout to shame them," she had once told him. "Let them stand in the silence of their own lives." But silence right now tasted like salt. The manager cleared his throat. "Ma'am, this will only take a second." Celeste's hand slowly lifted her purse strap from her shoulder. Her movements were controlled, almost ceremonial. She held the bag in front of her, then placed it gently on the glass counter, unzipped it, stepped back. Inside, a wallet, a phone, 2 lipsticks, a folded scarf, a pack of gum. The guard didn't touch anything, just looked, then nodded. "All clear," he said, as if that solved something. Celeste zipped the bag shut. Her hands were steady, but her eyes glistened, not with tears, with heat, with something between rage and sorrow. The kind of grief that's lived in 1,000 micro-moments over a lifetime of being presumed guilty. No apology followed. None. Not from Riley. Not from the manager. Not from the security man who had just publicly questioned her integrity, without evidence, without warning, without cause. The room resumed its polite hum, but the air had changed. It wasn't just tension now. It was shame. But not on the faces where it belonged. Shaq stepped closer to Celeste, leaned in, and asked, "You good?" She nodded once. He turned to the manager. "Get your owner on the phone." The man blinked. "Sir?" You heard me.
Riley tried to interject, but Shaq cut her off with a single glance. The kind of look that doesn't need volume to silence a room. His expression didn't carry anger, just truth, heavy, undeniable, and echoing from a deeper place. Caleb reappeared within minutes, called from wherever executives hide when the air gets too thick. He arrived with apologies on his lips and confusion in his posture. "I'm told there was an incident," he began, trying to sound uninvolved. Shaq's voice was low, measured, but each word landed like a slow drum. "Your staff accused my wife of theft. In front of a dozen people, without proof, without cause. All because she looked at a necklace. That's what happened." Caleb looked at the security man, who avoided eye contact. Then at Riley, whose posture had tightened like rope. "I wasn't aware of any." Shaq cut him off with a raised hand. Not aggressive, but commanding. "No more explanations. No more protocol. You embarrassed my wife. On camera. In your store. And now we're going to make sure people know exactly what kind of establishment this is." Caleb's throat bobbed. He glanced toward the register, then to a discreet camera tucked into the chandelier overhead. We can resolve this privately," he offered. Shaq didn't move. "You already made it public." He turned toward Celeste, extended a hand. She took it, and in that motion, a statement was made louder than anything that had been said aloud. They walked together, past the guards, past the cases, past Riley, who now couldn't meet their eyes, through the glass doors that once welcomed them, and now seemed to gasp at their departure. Outside, the world continued. The sun shone. Cars passed. The man on the curb still sat with his cardboard sign, the $20 bill now folded neatly in his pocket. Shaq paused on the sidewalk, breathing in the air. Celeste beside him, silent, her chin lifted, her pride intact. He looked back once. At the store, at the camera, at the face of every person who watched and said nothing. Then he turned forward, because some things aren't worth carrying out, and some things carry themselves. The doors of Caviton Reed's closed behind them with a hiss, soft and automated, but it echoed in Shaq's ears like the clang of a cell door. Not because he was trapped, but because he'd just been reminded that no matter how far he'd come, how high he'd climbed, how much he'd given, there were still rooms in this world that refused to see him for who he was. The guard hadn't recognized him. Not truly. Not Big Shaq, the Hall of Famer. Not the four-time NBA champion. Not the man whose jersey hung in rafters, whose name was carved in stone and stitched into legacy. Not the entrepreneur who had turned endorsement deals into empires. Not the quiet philanthropist who had paid for funerals of strangers, bought hundreds of bikes at Christmas, cleared layaway bills for single mothers without a press release. None of that had mattered. To that man, in that moment, he was just a tall, black guy, with a silent wife, and an expensive taste in necklaces. That's what landed hardest. Not the humiliation, not the subtle theater of suspicion, but the fact that all of it was so casual, so automatic. A glance, a protocol, a check, and the dismantling of dignity happened without effort, without pause, as if his humanity had an expiration date the world forgot to renew. Celeste hadn't said a word since they left the store. She was strong like that, but strength didn't make the sting go away. It only taught you how to carry it without breaking. They walked a few blocks in silence, the afternoon sun softening against glass buildings and trimmed palm trees. Tourists wandered past them, some taking photos, others staring, recognizing Shaq too late, unsure if it was really him. He heard a child whisper, "Is that?" The father tugged the kid forward, whispering back, "Don't stare." He wasn't angry, he was used to that. The half stares, the momentary hesitation, the ones who weren't sure if they should approach or apologize for thinking he'd be different in person. That part was easy to shrug off. It came with the name, but not the weight of the name. That weight started long before the trophies, long before the spotlights. It started in Newark. Before he was Shaquille, he was just Sean's boy to the neighbors, baby Shaq to the family. And before that, before he could even pronounce his own name, his mother, Lucille, had already taught him its cost. He could still hear her voice, stern, unwavering, that southern steel beneath every syllable. "They'll cheer your name, son, until they don't." He must have been 12 the first time she said it. He'd been invited to play in a citywide tournament, first time on a real court, with real lights, real crowds, and he'd scored 32 points. Reporters came, coaches whispered about scholarships, neighbors dropped off cakes. He came home floating. Lucille sat him down, put a plate of baked chicken in front of him, then folded her arms and asked, "So you think you made it?" He'd nodded, still sweaty, still glowing. She leaned forward. "That name on your back? It shines now. But one wrong move, and it's the thing they'll use to bury you. Be humble. Be kind. Be quiet when you want to scream. Because there's people out there who want to see that shine turn to ash." He didn't understand then. Not fully. He did now. Because it had just happened again. All these years later. All his success. All his growth. All his generosity. And still, a single woman with a walkie-talkie and a cold smile could try to shrink him back into something smaller. Something suspicious. Something undeserving. He stopped walking. They were in front of a mural now, painted across a brick wall in the middle of the city's most luxurious strip. A towering piece of public art. A black woman in profile, her afro shaped like a blooming tree, her eyes closed in power, her shoulders wrapped in words, respect, dignity, courage, truth. Celeste paused beside him. He stared up at it, breathing in the space, letting the silence settle. Then he exhaled and said, quietly, "My name didn't save you in there." She looked up at him, eyes soft, lips tight. "I didn't need saving," she replied. He nodded. He knew that. She wasn't a damsel. She was a force. Always had been. But still, it burned him. That someone could look at her, could make assumptions, could speak to her like that in front of him. It felt like a wound he couldn't stitch. He thought about the name Shaquille. It meant little warrior. His mother had told him that after he turned 15, she picked it for a reason. Not because she knew he'd grow to 7'1", but because she wanted him to fight, not with fists, but with presence, with purpose, with integrity. He'd built schools under that name, spoken at funerals, cut ribbons at shelters, donated to police departments, and community gardens, and cancer wards. And yet today, in a luxury store he could buy with pocket change, someone had looked at him like a problem. That was the thing about racism. It wasn't always loud. It didn't always scream. Sometimes it whispered in clipboard policies, in apologetic tones, in selective surveillance. Sometimes it wore suits and smiled. Sometimes it stood behind glass counters and said ma'am, while holding a leash you couldn't see. And it didn't care about your name. Not even if it was carved in stone. Shaq turned away from the mural and kept walking. Slower now, more deliberate. He thought of his mother again. Not just her words, but her actions. How she used to take him into banks and make him sit with her as she asked for loans they never got. How she dressed in her Sunday clothes to speak to managers who spoke down to her. How she once made him carry his basketball with him into a department store, just so the staff could see he wasn't there to steal. She had carried herself with grace that cut deeper than anger ever could. He'd modeled his life after that. But grace didn't mean silence. Not anymore. He pulled his phone from his pocket, checked the time, checked the camera footage trending online. Someone had recorded the incident. Already, the clip had comments, thousands of them. People outraged, people apologizing for Riley, people debating if it was really about race. He didn't care about the noise. He cared about the message. Because if his name wasn't enough to shield Celeste, then maybe he needed to remind the world what that name stood for. Not fame, not money, character. He slid his phone away, then turned to Celeste. "We're not done," he said. She met his eyes. "Good," she replied. Because they weren't. Not with the store. Not with the silence. Not with the invisible hands still trying to reach across generations and push them back behind the velvet rope. Shaq had built his name through discipline, drive, and decades of relentless effort. But now he was going to use it louder. Not to shout, not to burn, but to shine light on a truth too many still tried to dim. They walked on, the city ahead of them, loud and glittering. But the real weight followed them like a shadow they were finally ready to step out of. The air was still warm outside, but something colder had begun to settle inside. Shaq's chest, something that came not from the sting of what had just happened, but from the echo it left behind. He and Celeste moved in silence, her hand resting gently on his arm, not for support but connection, the kind of wordless understanding, born from years of loving each other through unspoken storms. He wasn't angry. Not in the way people think giants get angry. No shouting, no slamming, just a deep ache in the places people couldn't see. Because that moment in the jewelry store hadn't just been another scene. It had been a trigger, one that pulled him backward, not with sound, but with feeling. Something old, buried, something he hadn't talked about in decades. It came back suddenly, not like a memory, but like a mirror. He was 10 years old again. Georgia, 1982. The kind of small-town department store where mannequins wore polyester and the air smelled like carpet cleaner and stale popcorn. His mother, Lucille, had taken him shopping. It was early in the month, paycheck week, and she had saved up by him a new pair of shoes for school. Not fancy ones, just something that fit, that wouldn't split at the toes when he ran. They walked through aisles of neatly folded jeans and button-down shirts, past employees who smiled without meaning it. Lucille walked tall, as always, in her Sunday blouse and pressed slacks. She looked sharp, respectable. She always made sure of. But Shaq noticed a man, white, mid-40s, buzz cut and belt clip trailing behind them, pretending to restock, pretending to fold, watching every aisle they moved to. He followed, quiet, deliberate. Lucille noticed too. She didn't say a word. She didn't break her stride. She just turned to her son and said gently, "Stay with me, baby. Keep your head up." Shaq didn't understand then. He thought the man worked there, thought he was being helpful. But Lucille's voice had changed. Not angry, not scared, just tighter, like she was holding back something she didn't want to show him. They picked out a pair of shoes. Shaq tried them on, smiling big when he realized they didn't pinch. Lucille paid in cash. Exact bills, crisp from the envelope she kept tucked in her coat. The man behind them didn't leave. Even after they checked out, even after the receipt was folded neatly into Lucille's purse, he kept following. At the door, he stopped them. "Ma'am," he said flatly, "mind opening that bag?" Lucille froze. The cashier looked up, The people in line turned to listen. Lucille didn't raise her voice. She just stared at the man and said, "I paid for everything in front of your people, and now you're asking me this in front of my child." The man didn't budge. Just procedure. Shaq remembered the moment she slowly opened the bag, laid it out for him. Nothing stolen, nothing hidden. The receipt right on top. The shoes in the box, untouched. The man looked, nodded, and without an apology, walked away. Lucille zipped her bag, took Shaq's hand, walked out of the store. Not a single person spoke up. Not the cashier. Not the manager. Not the man who'd followed them like a shadow. Outside, Lucille didn't cry. She didn't break down. But when they got in the car, she took a long breath. Her hands gripped the steering wheel for a beat too long. Then she turned to her son. "Remember this," she said. "You can wear the right clothes, speak the right way, be polite, be patient, and still someone will think you're a thief. Why? Because they're scared of their reflection. And sometimes we're the mirror." Shaq hadn't known what she meant back then. But he did now. 40 years later, standing outside a Beverly Hills jewelry store, watching his wife get searched in public, in silence, for daring to admire something behind glass. He understood every word of it. Celeste still hadn't spoken about what happened.
Not directly.
But her stillness screamed. Not dramatic, not performative, just dignified and bruised, like a flag that wouldn't lower, even in a storm. Shaq knew what that took. He also knew how hard it was to hold it in. They reached their car parked just a few blocks down. Not valet. Shaq didn't believe in acting too rich for the sidewalk. He opened the door for her. She got in without a word. When he slid behind the wheel, the silence stretched between them like a tightrope. "Finally," she exhaled. "I didn't expect it to hit like that." He looked at her, then forward again. "Yeah." They looked at me like I'd done something wrong just for being there. He nodded. "I know. I didn't touch anything, Shaq. I know. I didn't even speak until she came over. I know." Her voice cracked, not from weakness but from fatigue. "And still I was the threat." The word threat sat in the air like smoke. Shaq's hands gripped the wheel, not in fury, but to ground himself. "It wasn't about what you did," he said. "It was about what they decided to see." She looked at him. And what did they see? He met her gaze. The same thing that man saw when he followed my mother through a store in Georgia. Someone who didn't belong in their story. Celeste's eyes softened. "You've carried that memory all this time." He shrugged. "Didn't have a choice. Some memories get stitched into your spine. You carry them whether you want to or not." The car was still. The street outside bustled with life. Tourists snapping pictures. People sipping overpriced coffee. But inside, the two of them sat in that suspended space between past and present. Between rage and restraint. Between who they were and who the world kept trying to make them be. Celeste spoke again, voice quiet. "What does justice even look like when the pain is invisible?" Shaq thought about that. What does it look like? It doesn't show up in headlines. It doesn't come through lawsuits. It doesn't live in press releases or staged apologies. Justice, for him, wasn't about vengeance. It was about visibility. About saying what happened. About naming it. About making sure the next person in line doesn't have to feel like they imagined it. "It looks like telling the story," he said, "even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts." She nodded slowly. Outside the window, a little girl held her mother's hand as they crossed the street. She was wearing a Lakers jersey. Number 34, Shaq's old number. She didn't see him in the car. Didn't point. Just skipped happily. Like the world still made sense. Shaq watched her and wondered how long she had before someone told her otherwise. His voice broke the silence again. "My name didn't stop them. Yours didn't either. So we tell the truth. Loud. Clear. With names. Faces. Receipts." Celeste looked at him, not with pity but pride. "We're the mirror," she said, repeating Lucille's words. "And they hate what they see." He smiled faintly. "Then maybe it's time we make it impossible to look away." It wasn't the kind of return anyone expected. Not that day. Not in that store. Especially not after the quiet wound had already been delivered and dressed in silence. But Shaq wasn't the kind of man to leave things open-ended. Not when dignity was on the line. Not when Celeste's pride had been stripped in public and left to bleed behind glass and velvet. They walked back through the doors of Cavett & Reed's. An hour later. No announcement. No press. No fanfare. The same automatic chime echoed from the ceiling. The same polished floors reflected their steps. But this time, the air shifted first. The kind of tension that sweeps through a room before the storm hits. Heads turned quickly. Conversations paused. Even the soft classical music seemed to hold its breath. Shaq's frame moved with the same ease it always did. Calm, deliberate. But now there was something different in the way he held himself. Not aggression. Not anger. Intention. A man who had decided the moment wouldn't pass without a mark. Celeste walked beside him again, her posture just as poised, her eyes just as strong. But there was a current between them now. A silent agreement. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about them. It was about what people remember, and what they would learn to never forget. Riley was behind the center counter again. Her eyes met theirs, and something flickered. Recognition. Discomfort. Perhaps regret. But the performative kind, the one people wear when they realize they might have made a mistake. Not because they understand it, but because the consequences are circling. She stepped forward. "Mr. O'Neill," she said, keeping her voice sweet but controlled. "Welcome back. I hope everything is—" Shaq held up a hand. Just a gentle halt in the air. "I'd like to see the sapphire necklace," he said. His tone was smooth, firm. No rise, no demand. But it was a statement, not a request. Riley blinked. A slight shift in her shoulders. "I'm afraid that particular piece isn't available for viewing right now." Shaq looked at her. Not with heat, but with weight. The kind of gaze that reminded you he'd been looked down on longer than you'd been alive. And he still stood taller. "Is that so?" he said. She nodded quickly, her voice softening, almost cautious. "It's an extremely delicate piece. It's kept in reserve, unless—" Shaq stepped back, not dramatically. Just one step, enough to open the space around him. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone. No theatrics, just quiet movement. He tapped once, held the phone to his ear, and waited. Celeste stood beside him, silent, watching. The entire floor seemed still. "Yeah," Shaq said into the phone. "I need a transfer. 12 million. Yes, in full. Right now. Same account." There was a pause. Then, to Cavett and Reed's. "Jewelry. Beverly Hills location." Another pause. "No. No rush. Just make it clean. I'll hold." The people around him had stopped pretending. The whispers had begun. The clerk by the far wall leaned in to her coworker and murmured something that turned her eyes wide. A customer dropped his sunglasses from his hand and didn't bother to pick them up. The security guard near the door adjusted his earpiece and cleared his throat, looking toward the office. Shaq said nothing else, just waited. Another few seconds passed, and then he nodded. "Got it. Appreciate you," he said into the phone. Then he hung up. Silence. Then slowly, deliberately, he turned to Riley. "I just bought it." Riley's mouth opened slightly, as if to speak, but no words arrived. Her hand rested on the counter, knuckles pale. Shaq leaned in slightly. Not threatening, not boastful, just present. "I'm not here to cause a scene," he said, "but I am going to ask you a question, and I want you to answer it for yourself." She swallowed. "Do you know who you just insulted?" There was no answer, only the faintest shiver in her brow, the sound of her breath thickening. He didn't press. He didn't need to. The store's floor manager, Caleb, emerged from the back office, his face pale, his pace quick. "Mr. O'Neill," he said, "I just got the confirmation, sir. Please accept our apologies for earlier. It seems there was a misunderstanding, and I can assure you." Shaq turned toward him. "Just slightly." "No misunderstanding," he said calmly. "She saw a black woman near a necklace and assumed she didn't belong. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a choice." Caleb stammered. We deeply regret the—" Shaq's eyes didn't waver. "It's not about regret. It's about how you run your store." The owner arrived shortly after. Older man, gray hair, expensive blazer, nervous eyes. He extended a hand. Shaq looked at it, then looked at Celeste. She didn't say anything. But her silence said plenty. The owner pulled his hand back. "The necklace will be packed immediately, of course. Gift wrapped, insured, delivered. Anything you need. We'd like to offer—" Shaq raised a hand. "Don't." The owner blinked. "I'm not taking it," Shaq said. Caleb frowned. "But, sir, you just—" "I bought it," Shaq clarified. "But I'm not keeping it." Confusion crept in like fog. "I want the funds sent to a transfer foundation," he said. Use the money to fund scholarship programs. Start with women's colleges. Then expand. Black students. Minority-run business incubators. You'll get the paperwork within the hour. The entire room stilled. And that necklace, he added, nodding toward the display, is going into a vault. Not for sale. Not for show. I want a picture of it hanging in your lobby, with a plaque beneath it that explains why it's no longer for purchase. Caleb looked like he might faint. Riley had gone silent entirely, her hands tucked behind the counter, her expression unreadable. Shaq turned back to Celeste. He stepped closer. His voice softened, barely above a whisper. This is for every time they made you feel small. Her eyes met his. There was no tear, no smile, no sigh, just the deep, breathless stillness of being seen. Fully, finally, he turned back to the crowd. Don't worry, he said to no one, and everyone. You'll still get your donation receipt. That's the part people always remember. And with that he turned toward the door. Celeste followed, her steps light. Sure. No security escort, no paparazzi, no yelling, just quiet. And every step they took away from that store was a lesson etched in marble. You don't buy back dignity. You prove why it was never for sale in the first place. It started with a whisper on the internet. Just one shaky cell phone clip, 37 seconds long, posted by a college student who happened to be browsing for an engagement ring. In the video you couldn't see much, just Shaq's towering frame, Celeste's stillness, the manager's apologetic nods, Riley's frozen face behind the counter. But the audio was crisp, every word clear, especially Shaq's "Do you know who you just insulted?" By the next morning it had been viewed over 7 million times. The headline that caught fire wasn't written by a news anchor, but by a tweet. A simple, searing line. Big Shaq buys $12 million necklace after wife is profiled for just looking at it. The internet ignited like dry brush in a lightning storm. On TikTok, creators posted frame-by-frame breakdowns of the video. On Instagram, fashion influencers weighed in, not on the necklace, but on Celeste, her composure, her restraint, her grace under surveillance. On Twitter, politicians jumped on both sides of the discourse, throwing buzzwords like racism, overreaction, accountability and class warfare into the arena like grenades. The store, Caviton Reads, had its name dragged through every major outlet within 12 hours. Their official page went dark, and their comments section filled with more fire emojis and middle fingers than compliments. Yelp reviews dropped to 1 star overnight. Protesters showed up in designer shades and homemade cardboard signs. They stood outside the marble entrance chanting things like "Respect has no receipt," and "She's not a thief, your fear." Shaq hadn't said a word publicly. Not a tweet, not a quote, not even a press release. But his silence only amplified the message. Because the truth didn't need embellishment. It was already there, trapped in pixels, wrapped in tone, stitched into the expression on Celeste's face as she opened her purse in public. You couldn't edit that. You couldn't unsee it. You couldn't unhear the careful pause in the manager's voice when Shaq asked if their policy applied to everyone. And then came the deep dive stories. Reporters started doing what they do best, digging. They found footage from Shaq's past, grainy clips from 2 decades ago, where he'd quietly donate backpacks to underfunded schools. A woman in South Carolina posted a story about how he'd paid off her mother's mortgage after a tornado. A father shared how Shaq had anonymously covered the hospital bills for his daughter's leukemia treatment. Stories that had never gone viral before. Because they weren't loud. Because Shaq had never needed the credit. But now, in the harsh light of racial profiling, they became evidence. Evidence that this man, this gentle giant, had been building bridges in silence, while others were busy watching who walked into jewelry stores. The public turned hard, not just in support of Shaq and Celeste, but against the system that allowed what happened to happen so smoothly. Caviton Reads issued a statement within 24 hours. It read like every corporate apology. Clean, lifeless, clinical. We are committed to serving our clients with dignity and respect. We are investigating the incident involving Mr. O'Neill and his wife. We deeply regret any offense and are reviewing our policies moving forward. But the damage was done. And it wasn't just digital. The morning after the clip went viral, Shaq sat in his kitchen, reading the physical newspaper like he always did. It wasn't a habit from nostalgia. It was discipline, tangible, weighted, grounded in the real. The Los Angeles Times ran the story on the front page. Dignity bought back in cash. Shaq responds to racial profiling with one tweet. Celeste came in wearing her robe, holding her coffee. Her eyes scanned the headline, then met his. "You okay with this?" she asked. Shaq leaned back in his chair. "Does it matter?" She smiled faintly. "It does to me." He didn't answer right away. He turned the page slowly. There, beneath the fold was a photo of him holding a little girl smiling, her arms wrapped around his neck, taken years ago at a Christmas charity drive he never posted about. He exhaled. "I didn't ask for this stage," he said. "But now that they built it, you're standing on it," Celeste finished. He nodded. Justice wasn't always about courtrooms or settlements. Sometimes justice came in the form of visibility, being seen for who you are when someone tried to reduce you to who they feared you might be. And now Shaq wasn't just seen, he was being watched. Every move, every word, every breath. The foundation that had received the $12 million transfer issued a press release, detailing how they planned to divide the funds: endowments for historically black colleges, scholarships for female entrepreneurs, seed money for mental health programs in underserved communities. It was the kind of change that moved slowly but settled deeply. Still, the backlash from some corners was as sharp as expected. Pundits on cable shows argued Shaq overreacted, that the store clerk was just doing her job, that race was being weaponized, that celebrity privilege doesn't give you the right to shame working-class employees. Shaq didn't respond. He didn't need to, because every time they played the video, the silence in that store said more than any shouting match on cable news could. Then came the moment no one expected. Riley, the store clerk, went on a podcast. It was a low-profile show, nothing mainstream, but her clip went viral just the same. In the interview, she cried. She said she felt threatened when Shaq returned to the store. She claimed the entire event had been misinterpreted, and that she'd worked there for years without incident. And then she dropped the line that lit the internet on fire. "I was just trying to protect the merchandise." Within minutes, that soundbite became a meme, a rallying cry, a scarlet phrase. Because that was the truth underneath it all, wasn't it? The merchandise had been more protected than Celeste's dignity. It didn't matter that Shaq had changed lives. It didn't matter that he'd put a stranger's daughter through college. To some, he was still a threat in a hoodie. And Celeste? Still a suspect with a purse. But what Riley didn't expect was the backlash to her backlash. Women from all walks of life, black, white, Latina, Middle Eastern, began sharing stories of being followed in stores, of being questioned, of being treated like imposters in places where wealth was supposed to shield them. The movement took a name: seen and suspected. It wasn't about Shaq anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been made to feel small, unwelcome, unsafe in places that smiled to their face while scanning their pockets. By the end of the week, Cavett and Reed's announced a complete internal restructure. Riley was placed on administrative leave. Caleb was moved to a regional position in the Midwest. The store closed for sensitivity retraining, but the damage lingered. And Shaq? He never mentioned Riley's name. Not once. Not in interviews. Not in his foundation speech. Not even in private. Because this wasn't about her. It was about what she represented. It was about the millions of quiet indignities no camera ever caught. And now, the world had seen one in full color. So when a CNN anchor finally got Shaq to sit down, days later, and asked him the question, "Did it feel like justice?" Shaq paused, then answered the only way he could. "No," he said. "It felt like a beginning." Shaq always knew backlash was part of truth-telling. He'd seen it on the court, in boardrooms, in classrooms where he'd sat at the back just to keep the focus off his size. But he hadn't expected it to come like this, from paperwork, from polished lawyers, from quiet threats and expensive suits filed in clean courtrooms. The lawsuit hit 3 weeks after the story broke. Filed by Cavett and Reed's. Defamation. That was the official word. They claimed his presence and the public reaction, which he, quote, knowingly incited through conspicuous performance and the purposeful leveraging of fame, had caused irreparable harm to their brand. They cited declining sales, store closures, employee resignation. They framed it not as justice fighting back, but as an overcorrection gone nuclear. But that wasn't the twist. That came 2 days later, when Riley filed her own suit. Against Shaq personally. Emotional distress, workplace trauma, fear for her safety. She claimed she had reason to believe that Shaq's return to the store was meant to intimidate, that he had weaponized his status and public following to jeopardize her livelihood. Her team used words like menacing, coercive, calculated. They painted him not as a gentle giant, but as a figure of power leveraged through silence, a man who had, in their words, mobilized public hostility under the guise of moral clarity. The irony was thick, because what they were really doing wasn't defending themselves. They were defending the structure, the one that folds on itself when challenged, that turns narrative into noise, that rewrites its own sins to protect the walls they were built on. It wasn't about Riley, not really. It was about making sure no one ever tried that again. And the media? They shifted, just as Shaq expected they would. Certain channels brought in experts to debate if profiling even occurred. Others ran exposés that reframed Shaq's act of philanthropy as performative, exaggerated, egotistical. One network invited Riley's lawyer to speak on a primetime segment. Mr. O'Neill used his wealth as a weapon, the lawyer said. My client feared for her future. She feared for her safety. And that fear is just as valid as any celebrity's grievance. It would have been laughable if it didn't sting so deep. Because what they were doing was familiar. Turn the victim into a threat. Turn silence into strategy. Turn dignity into danger. And then they came for Celeste. It always happens in pairs. If they can't crack the shield, they attack the heart behind it. Old photos surfaced. From her days as a college activist. One of them showed her at a protest, megaphone in hand, expression defiant. The caption called her a radical, twisted her history of community organizing into a narrative of agitation. One op-ed asked, was this a setup from the start? The fire they hadn't seen coming wasn't Shaq's anger. It was his memory. And memories, when pushed too far, burn hotter than rage. Because this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Not just to him but to someone he once knew. Someone who had never gotten the chance to reclaim their name. He thought of Maurice Trent. They'd met in the late 90s. Maurice was a janitor at a school Shaq helped fund in Baton Rouge. Kind eyes, quick with jokes, loved kids, quietly brilliant, with a voice that could have taught seminars if the world had offered him different odds. One day Maurice had gone into a high-end electronics store after work. Still in his uniform, backpack slung over one shoulder, he was picking up a laptop for his daughter, cash in hand. The clerk had followed him. Managers stepped in. Police called. Maurice spent 8 hours in a holding cell. No charges, no apology. But the story got out in whispers, and by the time he returned to the school, the damage had been done. Parents whispered. Teachers distanced. The district replaced him, without prejudice. 2 weeks later, he never bounced back. He died 3 years later. Heart failure, they said. But Shaq had always wondered if it wasn't just his heart that failed. If it wasn't the weight of invisible wounds that finally cracked something inside. Shaq hadn't told that story publicly. He didn't think he ever would. But now, as lawyers drafted statements and media outlets reshaped facts, that memory resurfaced, not as pain, but as purpose. Because Maurice hadn't had a name the world cared to remember. Shaq did. And maybe that was the point. One morning, Shaq sat alone in his home office, looking at the framed articles from over the years. Championship wins, business deals, moments of joy. But his eyes landed on something else. A handwritten note from Lucille, framed in oak. Speak up, baby. The silence always favors the wrong side. That afternoon he called his team.
No more statements.
No press-filtered sound bites. He'd speak directly. Not in court. Not through lawyers. In his own words. At a local community center in Crenshaw. Just a short drive from the chaos. A town hall was organized. No cameras, no podium, just folding chairs, handshakes, and truth. Shaq stood in front of a room full of strangers, who knew him like family. Teachers, pastors, single moms, college kids, people who had seen the story spin and shift, people who needed to know the real weight of what was happening. He told them everything.
About the store.
About the moment. About Maurice. He told them that money couldn't buy respect, but sometimes it could prove a point. He told them that Riley's fear didn't stem from what he did, but from the mirror he held up without saying a word. He told them that racism doesn't scream anymore. It smiles, it apologizes, it files lawsuits in clean envelopes. And then he told them this. I didn't buy the necklace to flex. I bought it because for too long we've been asked to prove we're worth more than what they see. And sometimes you have to write it in ink. They can't erase. Sometimes you use the system to remind them. You've mastered it. The room was still. No applause. Just silence. The kind that settles in when truth drops its final stone into a lake. and the ripple reaches everyone at once. That night, the internet had no video. No one went live. But the message moved. Word of mouth. Back-channel share. Whispers turned into wildfire. And when the lawsuits made their way into courtrooms, the public lens had already shifted back. The fire Riley and Cavadin Reeds thought they'd start. They forgot who they were lighting the match in front of. Shaq didn't burn. He illuminated. The microphone wasn't wrapped in cords or surrounded by flashing lights. There were no endorsement logos behind him, no halftime clock counting down. It wasn't a stadium. It was a modest auditorium inside a renovated community center in South Los Angeles. A place built from donations, hope, and drywall painted over too many times. Folding chairs packed the space, creaking under the weight of anticipation. The carpet was worn, the AC inconsistent, but the energy in the room, charged, restless, alive. Shaq stood at the center of it all, not as a celebrity, not as an athlete, not as a multi-millionaire businessman, but as a man who had finally decided to speak his whole truth. It wasn't rage that carried his voice. It wasn't vengeance, either. It was the kind of still, deliberate voice you only find after pain has been processed and purpose has been chosen. "This ain't about jewelry," he said. His voice rolled through the room like slow thunder. Low, heavy, measured. "It's not about what was bought. It's about what was taken. Dignity, trust, my wife's peace of mind." The audience leaned in. Cameras were set up at the back, not by news crews, but by the center's own tech team. A quiet live stream had been initiated, pushed across a few platforms. No hashtags, no PR rollout, just real people watching a real man speak real pain. "I've played through injury, played through noise, played through people doubting me. But nothing, and I mean nothing, hurts like watching the woman you love get made to feel small for being nothing more than present." He paused, his hands folded in front of him. His eyes never left the people. When Celeste opened that purse, she didn't just open a bag. She opened history. She opened generations of being followed, suspected, accused without reason. She opened every department store my mama ever got stared down in. Every just doing my job lie. Every polite insult dressed in policy. There were no cheers. No applause. Just silence. Thick. Holding space for every person in that room who had lived it, been through it, been made to feel it. "My wife," he continued, "did not cry in public. But behind closed doors? Behind the camera? She asked me a question I couldn't answer." He swallowed. "She said, 'When will it be enough?' And I didn't know. Because I've built schools, paid for funerals, covered bills, shook hands with governors, hugged kids I'll never meet again. I thought maybe if I did enough good, it'd protect the people I love. A breath. But this world don't measure you by your good deeds. It measures you by the boxes it built before you were born." A woman in the front row wiped her cheek. No sound. Shaq looked down for a moment, then back up. "I didn't come here to drag anyone. I didn't come here to destroy Riley. She's a symptom, not the disease. And if I spend my energy cutting down people when the roots are still intact, then I'm part of the same problem." The livestream's viewer count ticked upward, quietly passing 100,000. A ripple through social media. Screenshots, quotes, clips. Shaq didn't notice. He was talking to the room. To the woman beside him. To the ghosts that had followed him from Georgia department stores to Beverly Hills jewelry counters. "What I want," he said, "is not an apology. It's accountability. I want policies to change. I want training to matter. I want people to ask why they reach for suspicion before they reach for service." Then he shifted. His tone softened, like a candle's flame settling. "I want our kids to see that grace is louder than pride. That you can choose the high road, not because it's easy, but because it's right." He turned slightly, gesturing off stage, and Celeste stepped forward. She didn't need to say anything. She stood beside him, hand in his, chin lifted. The crowd saw it. The smile returning, not big, not theatrical, but present. Honest. Healing. Shaq turned back to the mic. "You want to know what I did with the necklace?" he asked. A murmur rolled through the room. Everyone wanted to know. Headlines had speculated. Some said he melted it down. Others claimed he sold it. A few thought he framed it as a trophy of protest. Shaq chuckled lightly. "I gave it back." Whispers. Shock. Eyebrows raised. "Gave it back," he repeated. "Had them lock it in a case at a new exhibit we're building dedicated to justice, equity, and reform. It'll sit behind glass, under lights, just like it did at the store. But now, instead of a price tag, it'll have a plaque. He paused. It'll say this is what it costs to be heard. The applause was slow. Not the clapping of fans, but of witnesses. People who'd seen something ugly become something necessary. And the money, he added. It's already funding grants, internships, legal support for folks who get profiled and can't afford a camera or a court date. The crowd stood. This time they didn't ask permission. Shaq stepped back from the mic. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't bow. He just stood beside his wife, the way he always had. But now everyone could see why. The live stream topped 300,000 viewers before midnight. Hashtags returned. But this time, they weren't outrage-fueled. They were calls to action. Grace's louder started trending. Local news outlets picked it up. Then national. Then global. The store dropped the lawsuit the next morning. Their official statement was clinical. Mutual withdrawal. Reassessment of operations. The usual spin. But no one cared. Because by then, Riley had resigned. Her face no longer framed the debate. And Cavitt Reed's, just a name etched above a building. People now passed with a different kind of silence. Later that week, Shaq and Celeste sat down for an interview. One they chose, with someone they trusted. The interviewer asked him, "If you could do it again, would you?" Shaq didn't blink. In a heartbeat he said, "Because redemption isn't about revenge. It's about reclaiming your voice. And using it so others can hear their own." And with that, the world heard something louder than anger. It heard truth. Unfiltered. Undeniable. Unbreakable. The school in the Bronx wasn't new. The brick exterior had weathered too many winters, and the windows rattled when the subways rolled by. But inside, there was warmth, not from the heaters which buzzed and clanked like they were built during Roosevelt's first term, but from the people, from the energy, from the kids who filled its halls like music too loud to be ignored, too alive to be contained. Shaq and Celeste walked through the front doors like they belonged. No entourage, no velvet ropes, just two people returning to a place that had already felt the ripple of what they did. The kind of place that didn't care about who was trending, or who had gone viral last week. These kids didn't greet them with whispers or gasps. They ran up full tilt like they were meeting superheroes. "Big Shaq," a boy shouted, grinning from ear to ear, backpack bouncing against his shoulders. "You're taller than our blackboard," another girl said, pointing. Celeste laughed as she crouched to take a photo with a group near the trophy case. Shaq gave high fives, fist bumps, and playfully ducked under doorways as if the ceiling had grown shorter since he arrived. It was pure, unscripted, and miles away from the glare of the Beverly Hills storefront that had sparked it all. The hallway was lined with hand-drawn posters. One read, "Thank you for believing in us." Another showed a stick figure, Shaq holding a giant key labeled Opportunity. The third one just said, in crooked block letters, "Real MVP, Mom and Dad vibes," with a doodle of Celeste in a superhero cape. The principal, Miss Delaney, met them at the main office. She was short, fiery, dressed in a green blazer with a lion brooch that had seen better days. Her voice could carry through four walls and still sound like a hug. "We don't usually get royalty around here," she teased, shaking Shaq's hand with both of hers. "We ain't royalty," he said, smiling. "Just folks who don't forget where they came from." She ushered them into her office. Books everywhere. Framed quotes from Baldwin and Angelo. On her desk, surrounded by stacks of attendance sheets and old coffee mugs, sat a single photo frame, silver-edged, clean, centered perfectly like it meant something. Inside was a photo of the necklace, the one that had started it all. Only now, it wasn't behind glass. It wasn't being admired for sparkle or clarity. It was captured in a moment, still symbolic, sacred. Celeste stared at the image. She hadn't seen it in that way before, not as jewelry, not even as evidence, but as memory made permanent. Ms. Delaney followed her gaze. "The kids asked why we didn't hang the real thing. I told them some things aren't meant to be worn, some things are meant to remind." Shaq nodded slowly. There were no reporters in the room, no live stream, but the gravity was still there. Because this was what they'd meant when they said the money wasn't the story. This was what justice looked like in motion. Not loud, not explosive, but quiet, consistent, visible in the lives being shaped behind these worn-down doors. He walked to the photo, studied it, then looked at the wall behind Miss Delaney's desk. Empty space. A patch of wall without decoration. without identity. You mind if we add something, he asked. She raised an eyebrow. As long as it doesn't need a permit. Shaq laughed, then pulled a folded envelope from his coat pocket. It had no logo, no name, just a handwritten title, for the ones coming next. Inside, a check, another one. Not flashy, not announced. Endowment for teacher training. After-school mental health support. Scholarships for every graduating student over the next 5 years. It would never make a headline, but it would build futures quietly, brick by brick. I think you're building something here, he said, handing it to her. Miss Delaney looked at the check, then at him. You know this changes everything, right? Shaq shrugged. That's the point. Outside, kids began to chant his name again, drawn to the front office windows like moths to light. Shaq peeked out and waved. Celeste leaned into his shoulder, laughing as one student held up a cardboard sign that read, "He's taller than my future." He looked down at her. You ready? She nodded. As they stepped out into the hallway again, the noise erupted. Cheers, laughter, a couple of off-key attempts at freestyle raps in his honor. Shaq didn't interrupt. He just walked through them like a current, giving them what they really needed, presence, not spectacle. At the exit, one last student waited, small, serious-eyed, holding a paper in his hand. Shaq stopped. What's this? It's my poem, the boy said. For English class. We had to write about someone who changed something. Shaq smiled, took the paper, unfolded it carefully. The title read, The Necklace That No One Wears. He read it silently. Lines about power, silence, being watched, being heard. The final stanza hit like a piano chord in the chest. They tried to weigh us in diamonds, but we turned dust into gold. Not from what we bought, but from what we gave away. Bull. Shaq crouched, clapped a hand on the boy's shoulder. That's real, he said. That's truth. The boy beamed. My mom cried when I showed her. I get that, Shaq said softly. So did mine. As they exited the building, Celeste slid her hand into his. A city buzzed around them. Car horns, vendors shouting, subways humming through veins of steel underfoot. The world kept spinning. But in that moment, Shaq paused. Narration wasn't something he'd ever needed. He let his life speak loud enough. But now, as they stood on the steps of a place that had turned scandal into solution, pain into platform, something in him needed to say it. Not to a crowd, not to the media, just to us, the ones who had followed the story, the ones who'd held their breath in the quietest moments. They tried to measure our worth in carats. He said. Celeste looked over, her smile warm, steady. But real value ain't behind glass. It's what you give away. He paused, then added, not what you wear. And with that, they walked forward. Into noise, into legacy, into a world that still needed work, but also into a future they were helping to build. One brick, one breath, one unspoken redemption, at a time. If this story moved you, don't let it stop at the screen. Share it with someone who still thinks silence is safer than truth. Talk about the rooms you've walked through quietly, and the dignity you carried louder than any accusation. Then ask yourself, who are you when no one's watching, and who will you be when they finally are?